Before the World Cup became the biggest sporting event on earth, before the sponsors, the scandals, the superstars, and the billions watching across the planet, it was just an idea. One tournament, one world, one game that could speak every language without needing translation. But in 1930, that idea was fragile. Europe was far away. The global economy was shaken. Clubs did not want to lose players. Some countries did not want to cross an ocean for a tournament that had never existed before. 2 months before kickoff, the first World Cup still had a problem. The world had not fully agreed to show up, and yet a handful of teams boarded ships. They crossed the Atlantic carrying boots, doubts, pride, and a trophy that did not yet know what it would become. This is the story before the story. The birth of FIFA's great dream, the birth of the World Cup. Strong Media presents The World Cup Story, Episode 0, FIFA and the Birth of the World Cup. Long before the World Cup had opening ceremonies, global sponsors, official anthems, and camera angles from every corner of the stadium, football was already moving. It moved through ports, factories, schools, railways, and working-class neighborhoods. The game traveled with people, and everywhere it landed, people reshaped it into something local. That is one of the secrets of football's rise. It was simple enough to travel. You did not need expensive equipment. You did not need perfect conditions. You needed space, a ball, and people willing to play. By the early 1900s, football had become more than recreation. It was becoming identity. A club could represent a neighborhood. A national team could represent a country still learning how to see itself in public. And once football became international, it became complicated. Who could play whom? Which rules counted? Who represented a country? What made a match official? These sound like technical questions, but they are really questions about power, because when sport crosses borders, it starts touching diplomacy, status, money, and national pride. At the beginning of the 20th century, football had the energy of a global game. What it did not have was a global government. On May 21st, 1904, in Paris, a new organization was founded, the Fédération Internationale de Football Association, FIFA. The founding associations came from Europe, Belgium, Denmark, France, the Netherlands, Spain, Sweden, and Switzerland, with Germany signaling its intention to join. This was not yet the global institution people know today. It was small, mostly European, and still trying to prove it had a reason to exist. FIFA's first job was order. International football needed shared rules and official recognition. But beneath that administrative language was something bigger. FIFA was beginning to claim the authority to define what global football meant. At first, that authority was limited. The British associations carried enormous historical influence. Other countries had their own priorities. And then, in 1914, Europe went to war. World War I shattered lives, borders, institutions, and the idea that international cooperation was easy. FIFA survived, but only barely. That context matters. Because after the war, the dream of international football did not disappear. If anything, it became more powerful. The world had seen what nations could do to each other. Football offered a different kind of meeting, still emotional, still national, still intense, but played on a field instead of a battlefield. And in the 1920s, one man would become the face of FIFA's biggest ambition. Jules Rimet became FIFA president in 1921. He would become one of the most important figures in football history, not because he scored goals or managed a team, but because he understood the emotional power of international sport. Rimet believed football could be more than entertainment. It could be a meeting point, a place where nations could compete, perform identity, and be seen by the world. That belief can sound idealistic now, especially knowing how powerful and controversial FIFA would later become. But in the early 1920s, the World Cup was still only a dream waiting for a structure. There was already one major international stage for football, the Olympic Games. But Olympic football came with a problem. The Olympic movement was built around amateur ideals, while football was moving toward professionalism. FIFA wanted a competition built for football's reality, not just Olympic tradition. The question was simple and dangerous. If football was already global, why should its greatest championship belong inside someone else's event? But before FIFA could build its own world championship, the world had to believe that football could carry that kind of attention. The proof arrived from South America. In the 1920s, Uruguay was not a large country, but in football, it became impossible to ignore. At the 1924 Paris Olympics, Uruguay arrived and stunned Europe. The team won gold, defeating Switzerland in the final, and introduced many spectators to a South American style that felt technical, creative, and fearless. This was not just a result, it was a shift in imagination. For a long time, Europe had treated itself as the natural center of organized football. Uruguay's Olympic gold suggested something different. The game had grown beyond its birthplace. The future might not belong to the countries that invented football's institutions. It might belong to the countries that reinvented its style. 4 years later, at the 1928 Amsterdam Olympics, Uruguay did it again. This time, the final was against Argentina, another South American power. Uruguay won after a replay, and suddenly the idea of a true world football championship felt less like fantasy and more like the next logical step. That rivalry matters. Uruguay and Argentina were neighbors separated by the Rio de la Plata, connected by migration, culture, trade, and football obsession. When they met, it was not just a match, it was a regional argument about style, pride, and who had the right to call themselves the best. For FIFA, Uruguay's rise created a powerful message. Football was no longer Europe's private conversation. If there was going to be a world championship, the world had to be in it. In 1928, FIFA approved the creation of a world championship. The World Cup was no longer only an idea, it was now a promise. The first World Cup needed a host, and FIFA did not choose England. It did not choose France, it did not choose Italy or Spain, it chose Uruguay. There were practical and symbolic reasons. Uruguay had won Olympic gold in 1924 and 1928. It had one of the strongest teams in the world. And in 1930, the country was preparing to celebrate the centenary of its first constitution. Hosting the World Cup could become a national statement. This is one of the great recurring themes of the World Cup. Every host country wants the tournament to say something. Sometimes we have arrived. Sometimes we are modern. Sometimes we are united. Sometimes forget what you think you know about us. For Uruguay, the message was clear. This small South American nation was not standing at the edge of world football. It was standing at the center. The centerpiece would be Estadio Centenario in Montevideo, built for the tournament and tied to the country's centenary celebration. It was ambitious, symbolic, and difficult. Construction was delayed by weather, and the stadium was not ready for the opening matches. That detail is important. The World Cup did not begin as a polished global machine. It began as a construction site with a dream attached to it. All matches would be played in Montevideo, using 3 stadiums, Estadio Centenario, Gran Parque Central, and Estadio Pocitos. Today, that sounds almost impossible for a World Cup. But in 1930, the tournament was smaller, experimental, and still searching for its own shape. And then came the problem that almost defined the whole tournament before it began: getting Europe to come. For European teams, Uruguay was not a quick flight away. This was 1930. Traveling to South America meant crossing the Atlantic by ship. It meant weeks away from clubs, jobs, families, and domestic football calendars. And after the 1929 Wall Street crash, the global economy was under severe pressure. The first World Cup was supposed to be global, but for a moment it looked like it might begin without much of Europe at all. Several European countries stayed away. In the end, only 4 European teams made the trip: Belgium, France, Romania, and Yugoslavia. That number tells you how uncertain the beginning really was. Today, the World Cup feels inevitable. Every 4 years, the world expects it. Cities compete for it. Broadcasters plan years in advance. Sponsors build entire campaigns around it. But in 1930, the World Cup was not inevitable. It was a risk. The journey itself became part of the legend. European players, referees, officials, and Jules Rimet traveled by ship. The trophy crossed the ocean too. The World Cup did not arrive by private jet, satellite broadcast, or global marketing rollout. It arrived by sea. There is something beautiful about that image. A tournament that would one day stop entire countries began with people on a boat heading toward a place many of them had never seen, to play for a prize the world had not yet learned to care about. On July 13, 1930, the World Cup began in Montevideo. Not with the perfection of a modern global broadcast, not with every major football nation present, not even with the main stadium fully ready for the first matches. It began with 13 teams in one city carrying the weight of a new idea. The first two matches were played at the same time. France beat Mexico 4-1. The United States beat Belgium 3-0. And in the France-Mexico match, Lucien Laurent scored the first goal in World Cup history. That goal was more than a statistic. It was the moment the idea became real. From there, the tournament would produce goals, controversy, national pride, a rising Argentina, and a host nation carrying the pressure of expectation. The final would become a Rio de la Plata storm. Uruguay against Argentina, neighbors, rivals, Olympic finalists. Two football cultures staring at each other across history. Uruguay would win 4-2 and become the first World Cup champion. But that is the next episode. For now, remember this. The World Cup was born from ambition, but it survived because people believed football could carry meaning bigger than the game itself. Politics, identity, money, media, migration, fan culture, the dream of being remembered. And underneath all of it, football remained what made the whole dream possible, simple, emotional, universal, and beautiful. A game that can divide a stadium for 90 minutes, then remind the world that everyone inside it understands the same language. The first World Cup was imperfect, improvised, and almost impossible. That is exactly why it became history. Next episode, Uruguay 1930, the first World Cup, a stadium built in the rain, a final between neighbors, a small country carrying a giant dream, and the moment football discovered what the World Cup could become.